Welcome to the fifth and final domain of the Security Plus Exam Cram Series 2024 edition. And here in Domain 5, we'll focus on a domain in 6 parts, beginning with a look at security governance. We're going to do a deep dive into risk management, including the quantitative risk analysis formulas, which, by the way, you were expected to know how to use on the exam this year. This is a change from the 601 exam. We'll discuss the elements of third-party risk assessment. We'll look at the importance of security compliance. We'll explore the types and purposes of audits and assessments, and we'll wrap with a look at implementing effective security awareness practices. Important information for governance and oversight of your security efforts. Let's dig in. You'll find a PDF copy of this presentation available in the video description, intended for you to download and use in your exam preparation. And the chapters within this course should appear automatically on the timeline, but just in case, you'll find a table of contents that's clickable in the video description, so you can hop forward and back in the video as necessary as you prepare. And as with the previous release of the Security Plus exam, I recommend the official study guide from Cybex, which includes 500 practice questions, 100 flashcards, and 2 practice exams, as well as the companion practice test manual, which brings another 1,000 practice questions and 2 practice exams. And if you register for the online resources so you can leverage these questions in an electronic format, I believe it's all the practice quizzing you're going to need to prepare yourself for exam day. And I will leave you links in the video description to the least expensive copies on Amazon.com. Now, Domain 5 focuses on security program management and oversight. And through these installments, we'll go line by line through every item mentioned in the official exam syllabus. Our focus in 5.1 is effective security governance, and we're asked to summarize the elements of effective security governance. And there is some terminology I'm going to establish for you here right out of the gate, from guidelines to policies to standards and procedures. You'll need to know what these 4 are, how they're related, and how they affect one another. We then have external considerations in our security governance, monitoring and revision, essentially monitoring our program efficacy and then revising as necessary, and we'll look at types of governance structures. We're going to wrap with a look at roles and responsibilities for systems and data. It's really the data roles that we'll want to focus on here. And you will want to understand who is responsible for what and which role is ultimately accountable. So let me start with a baseline definition of those 4 important terms. We have the security policy, which sets the overall vision and goals for information security. Security standards translate the policy into specific technical requirements and best practices. Security procedures provide detailed instructions on how to implement the standards, and security guidelines offer additional recommendations and best practices that can be adopted to further enhance security. Now we're going to work through these 4 in the order they appear in the syllabus, beginning with security guidelines. So the function of a security guideline is to offer recommendations and best practices for achieving security objectives, but are not mandatory. They provide the could for additional security measures. What could we do to improve our security posture? And they tend to be the least specific, offering recommendations that can be adapted to specific situations. For example, employees are encouraged to take advantage of security awareness training programs, a gentle nudging of sorts. Next, we have security policies, which provide the overall high-level direction and objectives for information security within an organization. It defines the why behind security measures. So when we get down the road and attempt to implement our security strategy, we'll derive what we do from the why we're going to do it, contained in our security policies. These are general statements and principles, often pretty broad in scope. For example, the organization is committed to protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of its information assets. So, in spite of the fact that that's high level, it is actionable. Policies are a major input to procedures. Policies are the why, the procedures are what. There are half a dozen policies called out in the syllabus. We'll step through those now. We have the acceptable use policy, which defines allowed and appropriate uses of the organization's IT resources. And will also generally detail prohibited activities that could compromise security. So things like downloading unauthorized software, using social media during work hours. And it's often a document that employees sign as part of their onboarding process. Then we have the information security policy, which sets the overall direction for information security within the organization. This can provide some guidance to IT and security in designing and implementing systems and services, establishing the right amount of resilience and recoverability. Incident response, which sets the high-level direction for how the organization will identify, contain, eradicate, and recover from security incidents. And the software development lifecycle, which is high-level guidance that software development teams must follow in creating software. It acts as a roadmap, ensuring quality, security, and efficiency during development. And this may steer the organization's development team, the development group, in making decisions on what frameworks they'll follow, what project management strategies they'll follow. A startup would often go the agile route, which is going to be very nimble and iterative. Larger organizations might use scaled agile. Organizations working on mission-critical infrastructure, for example, high sensitivity materials and projects may choose waterfall. Next, we'll talk about standards. Security standards define technical specifications, often mandatory, as well as best practices for implementing the security policy. It provides the what and when for achieving security goals. Certainly more detailed than policies from a technical perspective because it specifies technical requirements for systems, configurations, or processes. For example, PCI DSS, which applies to processors of credit card transactions, would be mandatory. It's typically enforced in contracts. For example, credit card data must be encrypted at rest, in transit, and in use using a compliant encryption algorithm. So there we see the word must, which tells us it's a requirement. It's mandatory. Now we'll touch on some standards called out in the syllabus. Guidance on password complexity and password management comes from a number of sources. Some vendor-specific but authoritative sources like NIST and the Center for Information Security maintain guidance on password complexity and management. Access control, which specifies who has access to specific systems, data, and resources based on the principle of least privilege. So for example, ISO 27001 offers guidance on information system management that can help here. Standards around physical security can be numerous to protect physical access to systems and data. So this could include access badges, security cameras, fire suppression, HVAC, security guards. There are a number of authoritative entities that offer guidance on physical security. ANSI, ISO, and NIST you've perhaps heard of. NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, perhaps you haven't heard of. And for example, we could look at FIPS 140-2 or 140-3, a mandatory standard for protection of sensitive data within federal systems, which at its highest level also includes requirements around physical security. Encryption standards, which specify the algorithms and key management practices for encrypting sensitive data at rest and in transit to ensure confidentiality. So you'll see guidance here not only on the algorithms for various scenarios, but also the minimum key lengths. And these evolve over time, and they will be impacted by quantum computing, which is actually why a few years ago NIST kicked off a competition to identify some quantum-resistant algorithms, and they've selected a few in the last handful of years to run through the certification process. Moving on to procedures. Security procedures provide step-by-step instructions on how to perform specific tasks related to security controls. It defines the how for implementing standards. Procedures are going to be highly detailed, outlining the exact actions to be taken in specific situations. A simple example. A procedure for incident response. Upon discovering a security incident, follow these steps. Isolate the affected system, notify the security team, document the incident. And no doubt the steps beneath each of these, the subtasks, would also be detailed in that procedure. So let's talk for a moment about how policies affect procedures, the relationship between the two. So I'm talking about procedures here. So procedures derive from policies. Procedures are directly derived from the specific requirements outlined in corporate policies. Procedures ensure consistency. Consistent implementation of policies across the organization. They provide clarity. They translate broad policy statements into clear, actionable steps for employees to follow, whether those are folks in IT and security or our end users. And they can facilitate training. Procedures serve as a reference point for training employees on how to comply with policies. If you're new to cybersecurity, let me give you an analogy. I'm a big fan of analogies to make sure we're all coming along together here. So the policy is the recipe. The recipe would state the inputs and the outputs. The ingredients. If I'm making a pie, it's going to have things in there like flour and oil and butter. For security, we're talking about the data and the resources, and we need a desired outcome, a secure environment, efficient operations. I want a nice, beautifully browned pie if I'm baking, right? So same situation. And the procedures are the cooking instructions. So for a pie, I'm going to put it in the oven, pull it out after X number of minutes. I'm going to cook it at a specific temperature. So for example, it would detail the how-to, mixing the ingredients, our data handling, cooking temperature would equate to security protocols. Cooling time, our incident response protocol. There were some procedures called out in the syllabus. Let's walk through those briefly. We have change management procedures, which would detail the steps involved in proposing, reviewing, approving, implementing, and documenting the changes to IT systems and infrastructure to ensure security risks are assessed and mitigated along the way. Onboarding and offboarding procedures, which would outline processes for granting access to new employees and revoking access for terminated employees, ensuring appropriate access controls are maintained throughout the user lifecycle. Playbooks, which are detailed step-by-step instructions for responding to specific security events and ensuring a consistent and efficient response. So in the Security Operations Center, playbooks are automated as runbooks in SOAR. Security orchestration, automation, and response. Moving on to external considerations. So here we're talking about external influences to our policies and procedures. So regulatory, so compliance with data privacy regulations like GDPR, HIPAA, and PCI DSS might dictate specific security controls and reporting requirements. This will influence our policies, processes, and procedures. Legal obligations can factor as well concerning data breaches, electronic discovery, and intellectual property. Laws surrounding all of these will influence our policies, processes, and procedures. Industry best practices and standards relevant to your sector may provide additional security guidance. This would be especially impactful in regulated industries and high-risk areas. Regulated industries like banking and healthcare, high-risk areas like healthcare and public utilities, nuclear facilities. And depending on where you're located, you may have other influences at the local, regional, national, or even global level. Laws and regulations can all impact security requirements, and our policies, processes, and procedures should address all of these. Moving on to monitoring and revision. It's important to remember that effective security governance is a continuous process, not a one-time task. It's continuous oversight. Monitoring can take multiple forms, including security audits, regular reviews of access logs, periodic vulnerability scans, and analysis of our incident response metrics. And this can highlight for us areas where the security measures are working and where improvement is needed. And then we have revision. This is the process of updating security governance documents and practices. And these changes are based on the insights gained from monitoring. So monitoring can trigger the need for revision. And also changes in corporate strategy may trigger the need for revision. Let's shift gears and talk about types of governance structures. So to restate our purpose here, security governance is a process for overseeing the cybersecurity teams who are responsible for mitigating business risks that are security related. So security governance leaders make decisions that allow risks to be prioritized. And amongst other things, this ensures security efforts are focused on business priorities rather than their own. And there are a number of different security structures that may be employed. These might include a board or a committee, even a government entity, And these governance structures can be centralized or decentralized. Now, the most effective structure depends on the organization's size, complexity, and their risk profile. So let's take a look at each of these. A board, typically a board of directors, holds the highest level of authority within an organization. Their decisions are binding on the entire organization. So that means company-wide. A committee, on the other hand, would be a subgroup within an organization, and committees typically focus on specific areas or tasks that are assigned to them, and they're often created by and reporting to the board of directors. Their authority is generally limited to the specific area they are assigned to oversee, and their focus may vary. Next, we have government entities. So there are a number of government entities. NIST is one that I bring up repeatedly, and these entities may issue security regulations, standards, and best practices that organizations must comply with. In some cases, they're only providing oversight to government entities. In other cases, providing oversight to regulated industries. So, for example, FedRAMP only applies to government agencies, but U.S. government provides oversight to the banking and healthcare industries. The NIST Risk Management Framework applies to government agencies and is mandatory. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is designed for commercial entities, non-government, and it's optional. So the government entity's purview really varies by scenario. Okay, and then we had centralized and decentralized. So in a centralized structure, security decisions and controls are managed by a central security team. It sets policies and standards for the entire organization. In a decentralized structure, we're delegating security decisions and controls to some extent to business units or departments or teams. A central security team typically still provides guidance and oversight in this model, but some of the day-to-day decision-making and management is delegated out to whatever unit we've selected. We're going to wrap up with a look at roles and responsibilities. And what we see in the syllabus really look like data roles. So I would know these two roles. The data owner, which holds legal rights and complete control over a single piece of data, usually a member of senior management. They can delegate some day-to-day duties. What they can't do is delegate total responsibility. They're still accountable. We have a data custodian, which is responsible for safe custody, transport, and storage of data, implementation of business rules, technical controls, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, audit trails, etc. Usually someone in the IT department. They do not decide what controls are needed, but they do implement controls for the data owner. If the question mentions day-to-day management, that's typically a data custodian we're talking about. And if we look at GDPR, a regulation which applies to any organization with customers in the European Union, GDPR does their data roles a bit differently. So there are two roles that appear in GDPR that also show up here. There's the data processor, which is described as a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body, which processes personal data solely on behalf of the data controller. And notice it says processes personal data. So we're talking about the data of individuals. GDPR is considered the gold standard of privacy regulations. Then we have the data controller, the person or entity that controls the processing of the data, who is responsible for the data. So controller sounds a bit like data owner, processor sounds a bit like custodian. They're not exactly the same, but there are some similarities. And these are called out in the official study guide, so they may appear on the exam. There are a couple of other roles I want to make sure you're familiar with also. So two other roles. Data subject, which refers to any individual person who can be identified directly or indirectly via an identifier. So it's the person who can be identified. The person is the subject. We talked about subject and object earlier in the series. The subject is the person. The object is the data or other resource. Identifiers might include an ID number, location data, or via factors specific to a person's physical, psychological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity. Any direct or indirect identifier, essentially. And then we have the data steward. who ensures the data's context and meaning are understood and business rules governing the data's usage are known and followed. They use that knowledge to ensure the data they are responsible for is used as intended. So data owners often delegate some duties to this role. And that's a wrap for 5.1. And here in section 5.2, our focus will be risk management. And more specifically, the syllabus asks us to explain the elements of the risk management process. And I'll tell you, in this module, I see a massive amount of overlap with the CISSP exam, a security leadership exam. So we're going to touch on risk identification, risk assessment. We will dive into risk analysis and specifically into quantitative risk analysis and the related risk analysis formulas. We'll talk about a risk register, risk tolerance, risk appetite, risk management strategies, also known as responses to risk. We'll take a look at risk reporting techniques, and we'll wrap with business impact analysis. As someone who's taken the CISSP exam and created content here on YouTube for the CISSP, I can tell you from experience, every topic I see here is on that exam, and there are a few that are not. Many people think of the Security Plus exam as entry level. I'm telling you, the knowledge you're acquiring here is anything but. This is going to be great real-world knowledge for you and a big head start on another very popular security certification. So we're going to get into a couple of important terms, just starting right at the top of our syllabus. All important risk management concepts you should be familiar with for the exam. We'll start with risk identification, exactly what it sounds like. The process of identifying threats and vulnerabilities that exist in an operating environment, which can come from a variety of sources. This can include cyber threats, system failures, where we don't have good resiliency built into systems and services, and disasters, both natural and man-made. Risk assessment is the broader process of identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and prioritizing potential risks. Risk assessment really encompasses the broader process, from the initial identification of the risks all the way through developing mitigation strategies, which would include risk analysis. Now, risk assessment is not a one-time strategy. It's not a one-time event. There are multiple types of risk assessment we can use to identify, analyze, and prioritize our potential risks. There's the ad hoc risk assessment, which is an informal one-time assessment conducted in response to a specific event or concern. These are often conducted on an as-needed basis when we see a change in the environment introduced by a project or an implementation. When we have a new application or service or system come into the environment that changes our risk profile, we need to assess on an as-needed ad hoc basis. We have recurring assessments. These are conducted periodically at predetermined intervals, annually, quarterly. This is just part of the ongoing monitoring to track the evolution of risks over time in our environment. Then we have one-time risk assessment, which is a more formal version of one-time assessment as compared to ad hoc. It's usually in response to a security incident or a request from management, maybe brought on by a change in business strategy where management says, hey, we need to go back and reassess based on our new risk appetite. There's continuous risk assessment, which is an ongoing process where risk identification and analysis are integrated into daily operations. These are often automated, like recurring system scans. We're about to dive into risk analysis, but I want to quickly pause and make sure that we're clear on the difference between risk assessment and risk analysis. So just a quick level set. So we'll just look at the two side by side here. So in terms of scope, risk assessment is the broader process encompassing risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and mitigation. And risk analysis is a specific step within risk assessment focused on analyzing the risks we've identified. Assessment is identifying, analyzing, prioritizing, and mitigating, where risk analysis is evaluating likelihood and impact of identified risks. So it's that step within the process. So in terms of focus, risk assessment is the high-level life cycle. Risk analysis is down in the weeds in the detailed examination of risk characteristics. In fact, we see it right here. It is the analyzing step in assessment. Now we're going to step into risk analysis. So there are two ways to evaluate risk to assets. There's qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative assigns a dollar value to evaluate effectiveness of countermeasures. That dollar value is the key. It is objective. It uses formulas. So on the quantitative side, sometimes to prioritize, we'll see an initial calculation using an impact times probability score, but that just gives us a rough cut on priority so we can then follow up with our formulas and really assess effectiveness of countermeasures, the impact, the probability, etc. Now on the qualitative side, we use a scoring system to rank threats and effectiveness of countermeasures. It's a very subjective system. Qualitative risk analysis often uses low, medium, high, or a number scale, but we're not getting down to true numeric probability, impact, and cost effectiveness of the countermeasures. So qualitative is easier, faster, and less accurate. So if I were to summarize it, just put it simply, quantitative measurements use numbers like asset values and the cost of our security controls. Qualitative measures use judgments. And both methods aim to help management make educated risk decisions based on priorities. And the fact of the matter is, not every risk can be easily calculated through quantitative methods. How do I put a dollar value on the loss of my customer's trust? How do I put a precise value on reputational damage? I'm about to take you through the quantitative risk formulas. But before I do, I want to just mention an important note that you'll find on quantitative risk formulas in the official study guide, where it mentions you should be prepared to explain the terminology of quantitative risk analysis and perform these calculations when you take the Security Plus exam. That means you need to know the quantitative risk analysis formulas. Generally speaking, I would say this was not true with the SY0-601 exam, so this represents a bit of a shift, but I've got you covered. So we're going to start with some important terminology, some terms you'll want to be familiar with before we get to the formulas. So we'll start with impact, which is the potential consequence or negative effect that occur if a risk materializes. Asset value is the monetary value of the asset for which we're making calculations. And safeguard evaluation answers the question, is this safeguard cost effective? Because the bottom line is, organizations will not spend more than an asset's value to protect the asset. At that point, they could simply save their money, earn interest, and then pay to replace that asset should a risk be realized. So let's look at the formulas we'll be dealing with. And when it comes to quantifying potential loss, these four should be top of mind. Exposure factor, single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, and annualized loss expectancy. So we'll run right down the list, starting with exposure factor, which is the percentage of loss that an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated by a realized risk. For example, if I expected a $30,000 loss on a $100,000 asset every time a risk was realized, that would be an exposure factor of 30%. Next, we have single loss expectancy, which represents the cost associated with a single realized risk against a specific asset. The formula for single loss expectancy is the value of my asset times the exposure factor. So if we take that exposure factor example I gave you, an exposure factor of 30% on a $100,000 valuation means we have a single loss expectancy of $30,000. So if I state it as a formula, asset value of $100,000 times the exposure factor, 30% represented as a decimal, equals a single loss expectancy of $30,000. Next, we have the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. This is the expected frequency with which a specific threat or risk will occur within a single year. So within a single year is key. So for example, a risk occurs 2 times in a year. 2 occurrences divided by 1 year equals 2. That's our annualized rate of occurrence, twice a year. A risk occurs once every 2 years. 1 occurrence divided by 2 years equals 0.5. Risk occurs once every 5 years. 1 occurrence divided by 5 years equals 0.2. And I'll warn you on the exam, watch for annualized rate of occurrence that is less than once per year, because you're going to have that fractional ARO. That's something I expect they might try to use to trip you up. Next, we have the annualized loss expectancy. So this is the possible yearly cost of all instances of a specific realized threat against a specific asset. So if a risk is realized 5 times a year, what is that yearly cost? If the risk is realized once every 5 years, we average that cost out over 5 years. So let's look at an example. So our formula is pretty simple. It's the single loss expectancy times the annualized rate of occurrence. And here's an example. We have an office building that's worth $200,000. Our office is on the Gulf Coast of Texas. So if a hurricane hits us, estimated damage is 50%. Hurricane probability is 1 every 10 years, so a 10% chance. So we'll start by calculating our single loss expectancy. So we have a $200,000 asset. Damage is 50%. That's an exposure factor of 50% or 0.5. That means our single event total, or single loss expectancy, is $100,000. However, we say that a hurricane only occurs with a 10% probability once every 10 years. So let's calculate our annualized loss expectancy. We take that single loss expectancy of 100,000 times that 10% chance, that 10% annualized rate of occurrence, which gives us an annualized loss expectancy of $10,000 a year. So $10,000 is the magic number there. That is the value of a safeguard on an annual basis, the maximum value. So if I could insure my office building for less than $10,000 a year, that is going to be break even or better. If the insurance company said, you're on the Gulf Coast, we're going to charge you $15,000 a year for this insurance, well, it would be less expensive to just keep the money and pay for the damage when it actually occurs. Now, certainly I'm taking a risk there, because what if a hurricane happens more than once every 10 years? But on the other hand, what if it happens less than once every 10 years? So just to recap some terms and formulas here. We have the exposure factor, which is the percentage of the value of an asset lost due to an incident. Single loss expectancy, how much would it cost you if it happened just one time? And remember, the single loss expectancy formula is the asset value times the exposure factor. Annualized rate of occurrence, how many times does it happen in 1 year? Remember to watch for annualized rates of occurrence where it occurs less than once a year, so the rate of occurrence is longer than a year, because you're going to have a fractional ARO. Remember, 1 occurrence every 5 years is 1 divided by 5, or 0.2. I think that's an area where you could get tripped up. Annualized loss expectancy, how much will you lose per year? So for the annualized loss expectancy, that's single loss expectancy times the annualized rate of occurrence. Or if you wanted to state it another way, the asset value times the exposure factor, which equals the single loss expectancy, times the annualized rate of occurrence. Then last but not least, we have annualized rate of occurrence, which answers the question, how many times is the risk realized in 1 year? So remember to watch for annualized rate of occurrence longer than 1 year, which will be represented as a fraction. So 1 occurrence every 5 years, 1 divided by 5 equals an ARO of 0.2. All right, and that's what I have for you on the risk formulas. Do remember the official study guide suggests these formulas may come up on the Security Plus exam. I understand this is a lot. So in case you feel you need a little more coverage here, I have a video that's 20 minutes long or so that is over in my CISSP Exam Cram collection, and it is quantitative risk analysis, just the formulas. This is the thumbnail. I'll put a link in the video description if you feel you need a bit more time with the formulas. That video in 20 minutes walks you through an example end-to-end using those formulas. I tell you at the end of every video, feel free to drop questions in the comments or ping me on LinkedIn. I'll tell you that ahead of time today. If you have questions on the formulas, if there's something that's just not quite clicking, leave me a comment and we'll talk about it. Okay, a couple of terms that show up on the syllabus you need to know. And these are two terms that refer to the possibility of a risk event occurring. So on the surface, they appear to be synonyms, and they are, but there's a subtle difference. So we have probability, which refers to the chance of an event happening. It's often expressed as a numerical value between 0, which is impossible, and 1, which is certain. So probability represents a quantitative approach, much like quantitative risk analysis. And then we have likelihood, which expresses the chance of a risk occurring using descriptive terms like high, medium, low, or rare. This represents a qualitative approach. Let's move on to the risk register. So the risk register is a tool we use in both risk management and project management. Now, sometimes it's used to fulfill regulatory compliance, but often it's just used to track potential issues that can derail intended outcomes. A risk register typically includes several details like the risk ID, description, probability, impact, severity, intended response, and the owner of that risk. The metrics in a risk register are going to vary from company to company. It should be considered a living document and updated periodically, at least annually. In a project, you're definitely going to be updating it more frequently than that, sometimes even weekly. And then we have the heat map. So a risk matrix is used to provide a visual representation of risks affecting a company. So the heat map shows the severity of the situation, with the most severe risks being in red. So you see the likelihood ranging from very unlikely to very likely as we go up, and the impact from left to right becoming more severe. So remember, likelihood is the qualitative version of probability, right? And you notice the risk matrix here, the heat map, it's using qualitative terms, low, medium, high, etc. Some key concepts associated with a risk register you should be familiar with for the exam. So we have key risk indicators, which are measurable metrics that signal potential changes in the likelihood or the impact of a risk. So monitoring KRIs allows for early detection, escalation, and mitigation. And we also have to think about risk owners. So each risk should be assigned a designated owner, typically a person or a department responsible for managing and mitigating the risk. If there's not a specified owner of the risk, nobody owns it, it's going to be sure to get ignored. So assigning that owner just ensures accountability for addressing the risk. Then we have the risk threshold, which refers to the level of risk tolerance established by the organization. The risk register may be qualitative, as was the one I showed you here, but it could also be quantitative using numeric scoring. Especially in project management, I find that the risk matrix, the heat map, is almost always qualitative because it's just human judgment as we go along. And we're estimating the severity and likelihood based on our past experience. Okay, now there's a phrase here at the tail end of risk matrix, risk tolerance. I want to talk to you about risk appetite and tolerance now. So risk appetite and risk tolerance are two terms often used interchangeably, but there's a difference. So risk appetite describes the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept without mitigating. The organization uses its risk appetite to determine its risk threshold. The threshold is the level of risk a situation must rise to before the organization chooses to take action to manage that risk. Risk tolerance, on the other hand, refers to the organization's ability to take on risk. So, for example, an organization with more cash on hand has a greater ability to maintain stability through financial risk. It's important that an organization's appetite and tolerance are aligned, that the organization's willingness to accept risk is well matched to their ability to manage that risk, to weather that storm. So the syllabus mentions levels when it comes to risk appetite. So again, just to restate, risk appetite refers to the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept. And there are 3 levels of risk appetite. So organizations with expansionary risk appetites are willing to take on a high level of risk in pursuit of high rewards. Neutral risk appetites take a balanced approach to risk-taking, and conservative risk appetites prefer low-risk investments and prioritize preserving their current security posture. Appetite's going to vary by organization based on their goals and their strategic objectives, but generally speaking, startups and organizations investing in cutting-edge tech tend to have greater appetite for risk. Now let's talk risk management strategies, also called response to risk. So there's risk acceptance, where we do nothing. You just accept the risk and the potential loss that goes with it if the threat occurs. Or as we say, if the threat is realized. Risk mitigation. So you mitigate a risk by implementing a countermeasure and accepting the residual risk. Residual risk is the risk that remains, the amount of risk that remains once you have implemented your security control. So risk mitigation is the act of reducing risk. Then we have risk transference, where we transfer or assign risk to a third party, such as when we buy an insurance policy to protect against damage. Whether that's insurance on a physical structure or it's cyber insurance to help in the event of a cyber attack. And then there's risk avoidance, when the cost of mitigating or accepting the risk are higher than the benefits of the service. We just avoid the risk altogether. And this could mean not implementing a new service because we want to avoid a risk that we can't mitigate or accept. Now, there's a bit of nuance when it comes to risk acceptance we need to talk about. It's called out in the syllabus, and that's exception versus exemption. These are the 2 flavors of risk acceptance. So, exception is a temporary deviation from a security policy or control due to specific circumstances. It's a documented and approved decision to accept a higher level of risk for a defined period. Exemption, on the other hand, is a permanent deviation from a security policy or control. It's a formal decision to permanently accept a risk because mitigation is deemed impractical or infeasible. Then we move on to the reporting phase of risk assessment. The risk report will detail risks discovered and generally recommendations for remediation as well, and the organization's leadership uses this to decide which controls to implement and which risks they're willing to accept. The risk report contains sensitive information, so it should be restricted to those with need to know. Reporting is the last phase of the risk assessment process, and arguably the most critical phase because it's delivering actionable guidance to the organization's leadership, so they can then respond to that risk. Next, we have the business impact analysis, which identifies mission-critical functions and critical systems that are essential to the organization's success. It also identifies maximum downtime limits for these systems and components, as well as the scenarios that can impact these systems and the potential losses from an incident. And these inputs enable the organization to make some decisions around their critical infrastructure. So the organization has some decisions to weigh, and a business impact analysis contains 2 important items: a cost-benefit analysis and a calculation of the return on investment. The cost-benefit analysis lists the benefits of the decision alongside their corresponding costs. Now, that CBA can be strictly quantitative, adding the financial benefits and subtracting the cost to determine whether a decision will be profitable. A thorough cost-benefit analysis will also consider intangible benefits, those you cannot calculate directly. And there are a couple of key recovery metrics we settle on in the process of our business impact analysis. There's the Recovery Point Objective, or RPO, which is the age of data that must be recovered from backup storage for normal operations to resume if a system or network goes down. Effectively, the max tolerable data loss between the last backup and the disaster. And then we have the Recovery Time Objective, or RTO, which is the duration of time and a service level within which a business process must be restored after a disaster in order to avoid unacceptable consequences associated with that break in continuity. Generally, the SLAs between a company and its customers will heavily influence the RPO and RTO. And finally, we have a couple of business continuity related definitions that you should know for the exam. There's the MTBF, mean time between failures, which is a time determination for how long a piece of IT infrastructure will continue to work before it fails. And there is the mean time to repair, MTTR, which is a time determination for how long it will take to get a piece of hardware or software repaired and back online. Pretty straightforward definitions. Moving on to section 5.3. And here we're asked to explain the processes associated with third-party risk assessment and management. We'll review activities associated with vendor assessment, potential issues arising in vendor selection, different agreement types we might use with vendors, the importance of vendor monitoring, the value of periodic vendor questionnaires, and the all-important rules of engagement. We'll start with vendor assessment, which focuses on understanding the security posture and the risk profile of both potential and existing vendors. And there are a few common assessment methodologies, including penetration testing, so effectively simulating a cyber attack to identify vulnerabilities in the vendor's systems and data security measures. And especially in the software and platform world, we'll see vendors include a right to audit clause in their proposed contract terms. So including a clause in the contract that allows our company to audit the vendor's security practices at designated intervals. Another method is evidence of internal audit, so requesting proof that the vendor conducts regular internal audits of their own security controls. Independent assessments, utilizing audit reports from independent external security firms that have evaluated the vendor's security posture, exactly what we see happening with the public cloud service providers. And a method that is really top of mind in recent years, and that is supply chain analysis, so mapping your vendor ecosystem to identify potential risks introduced by their subcontractors or suppliers. In fact, let's just unpack that briefly, because today, most services are delivered through a chain of multiple entities, a supply chain. And a secure supply chain includes vendors who are secure, reliable, trustworthy, reputable. So organizations have to perform due diligence to assess their vendor security posture, their business practices, and their reliability, indeed their viability. And this may include periodic attestation requiring vendors to confirm continued implementation of security practices. As we've discussed previously, maintaining one's security posture is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. And a single vulnerable vendor in the supply chain puts the organization at risk. So in addition to a vendor's security, business practices, and reliability, I also mentioned viability, and I want to unpack that just briefly. So organizations need strong project and people management to effectively perform vendor management activities, which includes assessing vendor viability. And I mention this because viability is a process often not conducted by the security team as it deals with an operational risk, and it typically involves assessing public information on vendors like their financial statements, performance history and reputation, or even a formal report like a SOC 1, which focuses on that vendor's internal controls over financial reporting. All of these identify potential weaknesses that could impact the vendor's ability to continue operations. Remember, the third leg of the CIA triad is availability, and if we wake up one day and our cloud provider is out of business, that's going to affect availability. So let's unpack right to audit just a bit further. So with some vendors, definitely smaller vendors that don't have the ability to give us audit report on demand type attestation, a right to audit clause is an important element of our contract. So written into supply chain contracts, it allows an auditor to visit the premises to inspect and ensure that the contractor is complying with contractual obligations. It can help us ensure that we're getting the quality of goods we've been promised, that we're not being shorted on shipments, that there are no financial issues, no malfeasance in terms of financial transactions happening. No unnecessary services being tacked on to our contracts that's causing us additional expense. So that being said, when it comes to supply chain analysis, on-site assessment is definitely an option. Although I'd say that option is fairly rare in my experience. Document exchange and review, so to investigate data set and docs in an exchange and review process is very common. A policy or process review, where we request copies of a vendor's security policies, processes, and/or procedures, and often ask them to e-sign to verify, to attest that these policies, processes, and procedures are in place and currently in use at that organization, giving us a fair level of confidence that the vendor is secure. Third-party audits sometimes happen, so certainly when there's enough risk involved, when there's enough on the line with a mission-critical vendor, third-party audits can happen, having an independent auditor provide an unbiased review of an entity's security infrastructure. So where we see that come into play often is in the cloud service provider space. So right to audit exists in many contracts. That right to audit a service provider certainly happens, but contracts are often written to allow your CSPs to provide their standard audits in place of a customer-performed audit. I can promise you, you will never audit a big public cloud service provider like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google. You'll be using their standard third-party audits. And they're very easy to get. It only takes a second. In fact, I'm just going to show you an example of how you can retrieve an audit report on demand from a CSP. So I'll show you on the Microsoft Azure platform. The process is pretty similar for all three major CSPs. So I'm going to go to Microsoft's Service Trust portal, servicetrust.microsoft.com. I've logged in with my Azure subscriber account because some of these reports do require an NDA because they contain sensitive information. So we see ISO, I see SOC, I see GDPR. I'm going to click on SOC. We know that SOC 2 Type 2 report is kind of an industry standard. And I can scroll down here and see applicable documents. And you'll notice that they offer these reports up not just for the platform as a whole, but for specific services or components of the platform. And I can see when they were last updated. So what they'll do for a lot of these SOC 2 reports is if there hasn't been any significant change, they'll provide you a bridge letter that says, hey, there's been no change since our last audit. And you can click in there and then download that specific document. So I get to the page detail and it's a PDF and I'll click and you see here it wants to make sure I'm actually a customer, so I have to sign in order to get to that document because they're going to ask me to agree to an NDA. Now I'm not going to go any further than that because that report does contain sensitive information specific to subscribers. But point being, you can go here, sign in and download a SOC 2 Type 2 on demand, and it solves that need without the need for the customer themselves to perform that audit. So in the vendor selection process, we have due diligence, which is the process to collect and analyze information before making a decision, signing a contract or transaction. It involves a comprehensive review of a prospective vendor's financial health, their reputation, security practices, compliance with any relevant regulations, especially if we're in a regulated industry. But due diligence doesn't stand alone. It supports the due care efforts, which are the actions taken by the organization based on their due diligence. We'll talk about due diligence and due care a bit further in this domain. So let's park that for now. The other area of potential concern is conflict of interest. We want to be certain that in selecting a vendor, there are no circumstances that may unfairly influence results in the selection process. So financial interests certainly come up. Vendor ownership, for example. If a customer employee or someone close to them has a financial stake in the vendor company, that can influence the decision-making process during vendor selection or contract negotiations. Kickbacks or bribes, where a vendor offers gifts, trips, or other incentives to a customer or employee in exchange for preferential treatment. This could even include inflated contract prices or relaxed quality standards. In fact, with our federal government, when federal government employees attend technical conferences, the conferences have to ask attendees, are you a government employee? And if they check yes, then they're not allowed to receive gifts of any kind. And that can include all the way down to not accepting something as simple as a backpack or a t-shirt, a simple gift that they would get at the registration desk when they pick up their badge in some cases. Information sharing is another concern in the conflict of interest category. So confidentiality breaches. So for example, a vendor with access to a customer's confidential information might misuse it for their own gain or even sell it to a competitor. This could include trade secrets or sensitive customer data of any kind, really. Or unequal information sharing. So a customer might not receive all the necessary information from a vendor about their product or service limitations, which potentially leads to biased decision-making or unexpected problems later, because a customer signs a contract and then later discovers something they didn't know, because it was withheld by the prospective vendor during negotiations. And professional relationships. So pre-existing relationships can be problematic, where a customer or employee has a close personal or professional relationship with a vendor representative, which can impact that person's objectivity during vendor selection or issue resolution. And then the revolving door problem, where an employee leaves their position and takes a job with a vendor they previously worked with, and can create a conflict if they possess sensitive customer information or knowledge, giving them something of an insider advantage as they're negotiating their contract. Now we're going to step into agreement types. We'll start with the service level agreement, or SLA. So SLAs stipulate performance expectations like maximum downtime, and often includes penalties if the vendor doesn't meet expectations, but it's generally used with vendors. So we'll sometimes see service level agreements within an organization where one department makes promises to another. We generally call those operating level agreements, or OLAs. These next two agreements sound very similar in their name, but you should understand the difference between them. There's the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, which is a formal agreement between two or more parties indicating their intention to work together toward a common goal. It's similar to an SLA in some respects, that it defines the responsibilities of each party. It is a more formal alternative to a handshake, but it lacks the binding power of a contract. It's less formal than an SLA because it typically includes no monetary penalties. And then we have the Memorandum of Agreement, or MOA. It's similar to an MOU, but it serves as a legal document and describes terms and details of the agreement. So an MOA is a legal contract, and MOU is not. That's the key difference you should take away. Next, we have the MSA, or Master Service Agreement, which provides structure to the agreements for vendors that you work with repeatedly. So the MSA is a contract with general terms between two or more parties as they enter into a service agreement. It should address compliance and process requirements the customer is passing along to the provider. The MSA should include breach notification and vendor duty to inform the customer of a breach within a specific time period after detection. So this MSA comes before a statement of work and spans projects throughout the life of the relationship. Next, we have the Statement of Work, commonly called an SOW. It's a legal document usually created after an MSA has been executed, and it governs a specific unit of work. So an MSA may document services and prices, and a SOW documents requirements, expectations, and deliverables for a project. So the MSA focus is overall and ongoing. The SOW is limited and specific. Next, we have the Non-Disclosure Agreement, or NDA, which is a contract with vendors and suppliers that prohibits disclosure of the company's confidential information. It's also used by companies to prohibit employees from sharing proprietary data. And the duration and terms may vary, so an NDA should be entered into with considerable care. Know what you're signing up for before you sign. True of any contract, really. And to close out agreement types, we have the Business Partners Agreement, or BPA, which is used between two companies or individuals who want to participate in a business venture to make a profit. Details will include each partner's contributions, rights, and responsibilities, details of operations, decision-making, and sharing of profits, as well as rules for the partnership ending, either at a given point based on an event or time, or if one of the partners dies or moves on. Moving on to monitoring. So continuous monitoring is essential to keep track of evolving risks with our vendors. And vendor monitoring means continuous monitoring to identify the emergence of new vulnerabilities. Also remembering that the vulnerabilities of one vendor can impact the entire supply chain, and validation of vendor security reduces risk. Your key takeaways being that monitoring your vendors is a continuous process and it reduces your risk. Questionnaires. So sending periodic questionnaires to vendors to gather updates on their security controls and risk management practices is really a form of self-attestation for these vendors, and it should elicit lower confidence versus an external vendor assessment. But it gives us a way to check in on the vendor to see if anything has changed since the last time we had a discussion of their security controls and their risk management practices. And finally, we have the all-important rules of engagement. So when we think about vendor monitoring and management, we want to establish clear boundaries, and we do that through rules of engagement. We want to define the purpose of any tests and what the scope will be for the people who are performing the test. We want to establish a clear agreement outlining expectations for data security, incident response, any communication protocols. It means we have a communication plan with the communication medium, the audience, and the intervals. We want to ensure everyone is aware of what systems will be considered, date and time, any constraints everyone should be aware of. And it should also include clear processes for issue resolution in the event of findings or disputes. You can apply rules of engagement to a penetration test. You can apply rules of engagement to ongoing vendor monitoring of any sort. It's just good manners, and at the end of the day, if a vendor knows that they are being continuously monitored, even in a passive way, it's going to encourage good behavior and encourage compliance. That does it for section 5.3. Moving on to 5.4. And here the syllabus asks us to summarize elements of effective security compliance. We'll begin with a look at internal and external compliance reporting. We'll talk about the consequences of non-compliance. We'll look at compliance monitoring concepts. And we're going to finish our session with a dive into various aspects of privacy. So let's jump right into compliance reporting. Reporting serves a couple of important functions in this case. Number one, it ensures organizations meet regulatory requirements, but it also ensures they maintain transparency with internal and external stakeholders. Internal reporting focuses on regularly informing internal stakeholders and management about the organization's compliance posture. It demonstrates transparency, and it keeps leadership informed about potential compliance risks for which they, as the leaders of the organization, are ultimately accountable. Accountability they cannot transfer. And external reporting, so submitting reports to external entities like regulatory bodies or auditors as required by specific regulations to demonstrate compliance with those regulations. And for example, GDPR, PCI, and HIPAA all require either annual or on-request reporting. Moving on to the consequences of non-compliance. There's the potential for reputational damage, which can result in a loss of customer trust and a loss of revenue. And the effects of reputational damage can last for years or even decades. Sanctions. These are legal repercussions that can be harsher than fines, including restrictions on operations or even criminal charges. Contractual impacts. So failure to comply with regulations might lead to contractual breaches, resulting in penalties or termination of partnerships. Fines. Failing to report a breach, for example, can result in fines that can reach into the millions of dollars and may lead to lawsuits. And loss of license. In some cases, noncompliance can lead to the revocation of a business license or a permit to operate. Moving on to compliance monitoring. Due diligence and due care involve taking reasonable steps to assess and mitigate security risks associated with vendors, systems, and data handling practices. The assessment is due diligence, and then the actions, the mitigation, would be due care. Attestation and acknowledgement, obtaining formal confirmation from relevant parties like employees that they understand and will comply with security policies and procedures, such as when we have employees read and sign that they agree to our acceptable use policy. Internal and external audits, which are regular assessments conducted by internal or external auditors to evaluate the effectiveness of security controls and to identify areas for improvement. And if done right, internal auditors reveal issues to correct before we're subjected to an external audit. A very common practice that an organization will self-audit a few weeks to a few months before they have, say, an annual external audit for a compliance scenario, because they can self-identify issues and correct them before that external auditor shows up. We can use automation, SIM and SOAR tools. SOAR is really the automation arm of a SIM solution. Vulnerability scanners or other automation solutions to streamline compliance monitoring activities. These can automate investigation, incident response, and reporting. Moving on to privacy, I want to start by making sure we are clear on the difference between privacy and confidentiality. Privacy focuses on the rights of individuals to control their personal information. It's about giving people ownership and control over their data. Confidentiality, on the other hand, ensures that data is only accessed and disclosed to authorized individuals or entities. It's about keeping data protected from unauthorized access. To state it even more simply, privacy is about people, confidentiality is about data. So digging into privacy, what is the source of our privacy rights here in the United States, for example, and beyond? So in the U.S., the basis for privacy rights is the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And also, the Stored Communication Act of 1986 extends the Fourth Amendment into the electronic realm. Now elsewhere, for example, we have in the EU the General Data Protection Regulation Act, which is GDPR. It protects subjects in the EU, but it applies also to U.S. companies. It's considered the gold standard of data privacy laws, and it applies to every company with customers in the EU. And by every, I mean every company regardless of country. If you have customers in the EU, you will respect their privacy rights as laid out in GDPR, or you will be fined, potentially sued, you will potentially be the target of a lawsuit, you will potentially be sanctioned, and the fines can be horrendously large. Security professionals are essentially responsible for protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all the sensitive information under their care, the CIA triad. And there are a few concepts we should all be familiar with here. Certainly legal implications, so navigating privacy regulations that apply to the organization, considering local, regional, national, and international data protection laws. This requires constant monitoring and oversight to ensure compliance. When you're looking at data privacy laws or privacy laws in general, you'll see the data subject mentioned. This speaks to the individual to whom the personal data belongs. And compliance practices should respect the rights of data subjects, such as the right to access, rectify, or erase their data. The laws will vary. We'll talk about some influences on law here in just a moment. And you want to know the difference between the controller versus the processor. We talked about this earlier in Domain 5 when we were discussing data roles. So distinguishing between that data controller, who determines purpose and means of processing data, and the data processor, who does the actual processing on behalf of the controller. Those roles get called out specifically in GDPR. If you'd like to revisit those, they're covered in section 5.1 in greater depth. The rules around data privacy, the law really comes down to jurisdiction, meaning which country has legal authority. And different laws and regulations may apply depending on the location of the data subject, the data collector, the cloud service provider, the subcontractors processing data, company headquarters of the entities that are involved. And we can have wide-ranging legal concerns. Legal concerns can prevent the utilization of a specific cloud service provider. They can add cost and time to market. They can drive changes to technical architectures required to deliver services. Because based on these laws, we might make different decisions about where we host our infrastructure and our data. But one truth that always remains, you never want to replace compliance with convenience when evaluating services, as this increases risk. And many privacy frameworks impose fines or other actions for non-compliance. And just to throw another wrinkle into it, sometimes you have laws between different countries that are conflicting, and it's up to you as the consumer providing services to customers to figure out how you make your next move to comply with those laws, which means you really need to work with your legal team. So moving on, I want to get back to those concepts around protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we have data ownership, which is about determining who has ultimate control and decision-making authority over specific data sets within the organization. Then there's the consideration around data inventory and retention. We need to maintain a comprehensive and accurate record of all personal data collected and processed. And it must be accompanied by data retention policies that specify how long data will be stored before secure disposal. What does secure disposal mean? It means not recoverable even through forensic techniques. And then there is the right to be forgotten. This speaks to a data subject's right to request deletion of their personal data under certain circumstances, such as those mandated by regulations like GDPR. And regulations like GDPR also come with timing, meaning limits or boundaries around how quickly an organization must respond to subject request, which means organizations must have processes and resources in place to handle those subject requests. And as an aside, it really all begins with an accurate data inventory. As a first step, organizations should develop a data inventory containing the following types of sensitive information, meaning they need to identify instances of these data types in their environment, including personally identifiable information, or PII, protected health information, PHI, financial information, intellectual property, legal information, regulated information. We actually talked about these sensitive information types in greater depth back in section 3.3 if you'd like to go back and revisit. That's a wrap on section 5.4. And here in section 5.5, our focus will be audits and assessments. And more specifically, the syllabus challenges us to explain the types and purposes of audits and assessments. We'll explore the concept of attestation. We'll look at internal audit and assessment versus external audit and assessment. We will explore the types and categories of penetration testing and their purpose. We're really not just talking about the what here in terms of audit and assessment, but the why we would use each. But before we do any of that, I need to quickly lay some foundation for you here and answer, what exactly is the difference between a security audit and a security assessment? Allow me to explain, and I'll give you a nice side-by-side visual here so you can digest these quickly. In terms of focus, a security audit is focused on compliance with standards or regulations. A security assessment is identifying and prioritizing risks. One is measuring your compliance on the audit side. The other is assessing if there are any risks of non-compliance. The purpose here, from an audit perspective, is verification. Is the organization compliant, yes or no? An assessment is evaluating and analyzing the organization to see if there are risks, if there are gaps. The security audit is generally a formal exercise, often by external auditors. Certainly we can have an internal audit, which is also formal. The level of formality with a security assessment will vary, and the more formal it is, the more likely we are to have a very clear scope of what is being assessed. In any audit or any assessment, the scope of what is being audited or assessed is quite important. And in terms of outcome, an audit will result in a report on compliance gaps, on areas of non-compliance. An assessment will include a report on identified risks and recommendations for closing those gaps. And you're going to find different people have different opinions of the definition of an assessment and an audit. I'm giving you the clinical definition here that is factually accurate. To give it to you most simply, perhaps think of the security assessment as studying for the exam, preparing for the exam. And the audit is the exam. And again, there's a bit of context that's important here. How punitive the audit results will be depends on the context of the audit. If it is a formal audit conducted by an external auditor as mandated by a regulatory body, there's going to be potentially some punitive measures if we're out of compliance. On the other hand, if we are conducting our own internal audit ahead of the external audit, or we have contracted a third party to audit our organization ahead of the official external audit, that can give us clarity on whether we would pass or fail the real deal, but it also gives us time to prepare to close those security gaps, those control gaps. With that out of the way, let's dig into the syllabus, beginning with attestation. Attestation is an independent verification of an organization's adherence to specific controls or standards. Attestation engagements can be internal or external, meaning performed by internal or external entities. And there's a bit of wiggle room in the phrase independent verification. There are levels. One can certainly interpret that to mean it must be an external verification because it must be independent. But the fact of the matter is, auditors, whether internal or external, should always be independent, meaning for an internal auditor, independent means free to report results without fear of punishment or retaliation. So that is to say, I can have independent verification of a fashion from an internal exercise, but there's going to be a higher degree of confidence to anyone else I'm presenting those results to if the attestation comes from an external source. And the syllabus calls out a few elements of internal and external audit and assessments. We'll begin with internal. So internal audits and assessments are performed within the organization itself, usually by a dedicated team. So we have compliance audits. These audits assess an organization's internal controls against industry standards or regulatory compliance. They ensure compliance with policies and procedures. And if we are in a regulated industry, our policies and procedures should align to our regulatory obligations. Especially in larger organizations, we'll typically see an audit committee. This is a committee usually reporting to the board of directors that is responsible for overseeing the internal audit function and ensuring its independence. It doesn't work exactly the same in any two companies, but that's the typical structure. Now, self-assessments are internal evaluations conducted by an organization's own staff to identify areas for improvement in controls or processes. The organization's own staff is the key differentiator here, but not surprising, given we're talking about internal functions. Now let's talk about external audit and assessment. External audits and assessments are performed by entities outside of the organization. So, for example, regulatory audits. These are audits required by government agencies or other regulatory bodies to ensure compliance with specific regulations, like Sarbanes-Oxley for publicly traded companies, HIPAA HITRUST for healthcare organizations, PCI DSS for companies that are processing credit card transactions. And the auditors and the auditing is coming from an appointed third-party firm quite typically. So it's not always the government agency or the regulatory body itself, but someone they have appointed. Often a big consulting company that specializes in that audit function. Examinations. This is a broader term encompassing various types of external reviews, including compliance audits and security assessments. An independent third party, an external, unbiased entity that conducts the audit or assessment free from conflicts of interest within the organization. Moving on to penetration testing. And we'll start with the categories of penetration test. So just to level set, penetration testing is a process that actively assesses deployed security controls trying to exploit vulnerabilities by simulating or performing an attack. A physical penetration test evaluates the physical security measures of a facility, assessing the possibility of unauthorized physical access to systems or data. Offensive testing focuses on the technical security of computer systems and networks, attempting to exploit vulnerabilities to gain unauthorized access. Defensive testing focuses on evaluating the effectiveness of existing security controls to withstand attacks, and integrated testing combines physical, offensive, and defensive techniques for a more comprehensive evaluation. So, to be clear, integrated is physical plus offensive plus defensive. And next we have types of penetration testing. So we have the known environment, where the pen tester is given a map of the target systems and networks, and they go to test with substantial or even full information of the target systems and networks. We sometimes call this a white box test, essentially because the light has been shown on the environment on our behalf. Unknown environment, where the pen tester knows nothing about the target systems and the network. They go into the test completely blind, in the dark, so to speak, and build out the database of everything they find as they go. Because they are in the dark, we call this the black box test. Then we have the partially known environment, where limited information is shared with the tester, sometimes in the form of login credentials. This simulates the level of knowledge a hacker with long-term access to a system would achieve through research and system footprinting. Sometimes called the gray box test, so we can think of that as being a partially illuminated view into the environment. So I call those terms out because you might see white box, black box, or gray box test appear as a potential answer on a question. So I wanted you to know the also known as options for these environments. And then just again to remind you of the all-important rules of engagement. The rules of engagement in the context of a pen test define the purpose of the test and what the scope will be for the people who are performing this test on the network. They ensure everyone will be aware of what systems will be considered, date and time, and any constraints everyone should be aware of. Moving on to active and passive reconnaissance. In passive reconnaissance, we're not interacting directly with the target, and as such, the target has no way of knowing, recording, or logging activity. This involves gathering data from publicly available sources. A few examples of passive reconnaissance: searching the internet, so searching for information about the target organization, its employees, and its systems. Reviewing media. We can examine social media posts, news articles, and public records that might reveal details about the target's security posture. Analyzing DNS records to understand the target's network infrastructure. And using search engines with advanced operators to find specific information about the target. On the Google search engine, we call that Google dorking. And next is active reconnaissance, which interacts directly with the target in some way, and as such, the target may discover, record, or log these activities. So this involves using tools and techniques to probe and scan the target for vulnerabilities and potential entry points. Let's look at a few examples of active reconnaissance. So we could use port scanners to identify open ports on target networks and services running on those ports. Sending ping sweeps to identify active devices on the network. Using vulnerability scanners to identify known weaknesses in the target's systems and software. Employing social engineering techniques to trick the target's employees into revealing information about the target's security practices. It's important to remember that you should never do these without a written, signed contract from that target organization. If you don't have scope and permission in writing and signed, these are not activities you'll want to engage in because they are trackable, discoverable, and potentially punishable. And it is our ethical responsibility to always do things by the book. And that brings us to the end of section 5.5. And here in section 5.6, we'll be focused on security awareness practices. The syllabus asks us to implement security awareness practices, which is another way of saying various forms of security awareness training. So we'll touch on topics like phishing, anomalous behavior recognition, which means helping our users to recognize risky, unexpected, or unintentionally bad behavior. An array of practices around user guidance and training, reporting and monitoring to monitor the efficacy of our efforts, and some end-to-end examination of the process, including development and execution. But before we dig into the syllabus here, we're going to get into some foundational material quickly around social engineering. Helping our users to understand the principles of social engineering lie at the core of teaching them how to make better decisions when it comes to protecting our organization from threats. So there are 6 or 7 principles of social engineering depending on who you talk to. We're going to go through 7. The first is authority. An attacker citing position, responsibility, or affiliation that grants the attacker the authority to make the request. Whether that's impersonating a third-party authority or someone of authority within the organization, that's a common approach. Intimidation. Suggesting that you may face negative outcomes if you do not facilitate access or initiate a process. Consensus, claiming that someone in a similar position or a peer of yours has carried out the same task in the past. Scarcity, a request focused on limited opportunity, diminishing availability that requires we get this done in a certain amount of time. It's similar to urgency, which we'll touch on in a moment. Scarcity tends to focus on quantity. Next, we have familiarity, attempting to establish a personal connection, often citing mutual acquaintances using social proof to establish a connection, a personal connection. We call this liking as well, meaning it's an attempt to get the victim to like the attacker because we'll do things for people we like, right? Next, there's trust, citing knowledge and experience, sometimes even assisting the target with an issue to establish a relationship, to build trust. And finally, urgency. Time sensitivity that demands immediate action, similar to scarcity, sometimes used together with scarcity. Limited time, limited quantity, limited opportunity. What these principles have in common is they are all attempts to get users to circumvent our standard security policies and procedures. So at the core of security awareness practices and training is to teach our users to recognize bad actors using these principles to get them to step outside their normal decision-making process. And to round out the foundation here, I want to touch on some social engineering attacks. And at a high level, there are 2 categories of social engineering attacks. There are physical attacks and virtual attacks. And the physical would include attacks like tailgating and shoulder surfing and dumpster diving. On the virtual side, we have an array of what are largely phishing variants, along with the watering hole. But together with those 7 elements of social engineering, those 7 principles, you'll have a good foundation for what we're dealing with, what we're trying to teach our users when it comes to security awareness. Because bottom line, in the world today, email is the number one way in the door to an organization for ransomware. Phishing is that delivery mechanism. So to summarize, social engineering is an attempt by an attacker to convince someone to provide info like a password or to perform an action they wouldn't normally perform, like clicking on a malicious link. And they'll often even try to gain access to the IT infrastructure or the physical facility. But as I mentioned, phishing is that number one way in the door. It's commonly used to trick users into giving up personal information, accounts, passwords, click a link, open an attachment, And you'll want to know the phishing variants out there. So you have spear phishing that targets specific groups of users. You have whaling, which tends to target high-level executives, or whales as they're called sometimes. Vishing, which is voicemail-based phishing, it's phone-based. And smishing, which is text-based messaging on mobile. But it's the number one cyber attack. It's an entry point for ransomware. You want to know these variants for the exam and on the job, actually. The official study guide also mentions that the best defense for social engineering techniques is security awareness training. Now, we see spam and spim show up in the official study guide as well, so more phishing variants. So spam you've heard of, no doubt, which is unsolicited email, generally considered an irritant, but we defeat that with strong filtering. And we have spam, which is spam over instant messaging, also generally considered an irritant. But your instant messaging and your mobile providers are providing some protection here. For all of your major carriers now, you can download an app that will identify malicious text messages, for example, and send those to the bin. But you want to create usernames that are not easily guessable. You don't want to add your ID to a public directory on an instant messaging platform to try to maintain some anonymity for sure. But do bear in mind, while these are generally considered an irritant, they're not always just an irritant. Both are delivery channels for ransomware. Let's talk through some physical attacks. We have dumpster diving, which is gathering important details from things people have thrown in the trash. This can target individuals or organizations. This could be the bin behind the corporate office. This could be your rubbish bin at the end of your drive that you carry down for weekly delivery. So we want to make sure we don't put sensitive information into the bin. We want to securely shred any paper that contains information we wouldn't want external entities to see. Secure shredding typically involves shredding in two directions. It's not going to be just shredding one direction into long strips. It'll be doing kind of a crisscross. Next, we have tailgating, when an unauthorized individual might follow you through an open door without badging in themselves. This is usually not an accident. Then we have eliciting information. This is leveraging social engineering techniques. So here we'd see casual conversation being used to extract information without arousing suspicion, which means they're going to be employing some of those 7 principles of social engineering to gain trust. But you'll often see these attempts involving very complex cover stories to provide social proof, to provide that connection to someone within the organization to make it sound as though what they are asking is okay. Then there's shoulder surfing, which is a criminal practice where thieves will steal your personal data by spying over your shoulder. And it's important we teach users to be aware of this because it can happen anywhere on any device. It can happen in the office with a consultant or other visitor in the office. It can happen at a coffee shop. Anywhere with any device, really. Computer, phone, etc. Next, we have farming, which is an online scam where a website's traffic is manipulated through DNS and it redirects the user to a different malicious website. That's a portmanteau of the words phishing and farming. Okay, that's some foundation, that's some background. Now let's shift to the items we see in the syllabus. So phishing, as we saw, is a deceptive attempt to steal sensitive information by masquerading as a trustworthy entity in an electronic communication. Might be email, might be a text message, might be a voicemail. So what we want to do to prepare our employees, number one, is to conduct simulated phishing campaigns to test employee awareness and their preparedness. This can help identify knowledge gaps that require additional training. And what you'll find is some of your online email platforms for the enterprise or third-party products allow you to create very realistic simulated phishing messages so you can test your employees, and those who click on the message and fail can be redirected to training in real time, where that malicious link in that simulated phishing email, when they click on it, says, hey, you've been phished, let's go turn this into a training opportunity. We also need to teach our employees to recognize a phishing attempt, so training employees on red flags associated with phishing emails. Generic greetings, typos, urgency, suspicious attachments or links, a known sender name but unknown sender email address, and then how to respond to reported suspicious messages. So we need to establish a clear procedure for employees to report suspicious emails to the IT security team. This should include instructions on how to forward the email without compromising security. This way the IT security team can look into that. We can forward that on to the AI service that trains our cloud email protection. All your anti-phishing, anti-malware email protection these days uses AI, uses machine learning, so anything your users report is generally speaking going to roll into that service and train the service to do better. Next on the syllabus, anomalous behavior recognition. Our employees should be trained to recognize when risky, unexpected, and unintentional behavior takes place. So let me give you some examples in each of these three categories. So risky would be activities like downloading files from untrusted websites, clicking on suspicious links in an email, sharing passwords or other sensitive info with other users, leaving work devices unattended in public. Unexpected situations, a sudden increase in failed login attempts for a user, so we're going to recognize this from the IT side, right? A user accessing sensitive information outside their normal duties, working unusual hours outside of their normal schedule, transferring large amounts of data to personal devices. This could indicate a malicious insider. This could also indicate a compromised identity or device. And then we have the unintentional. So a user using weak passwords and also using the same password repeatedly across multiple sites. We can do a fair bit to prevent that. A user falling victim to a phishing attack and entering credentials, which we address through awareness training, through phishing simulations. Printing sensitive documents and leaving them unattended. We'd certainly want to prohibit this in a company policy, but also something worth reminding our users of periodically in our security awareness training. And then there's the very common oversharing sensitive documents, what we'd call a data leak. Next on the syllabus, we see user guidance and training. There are several important topics that should be included in end-user security training programs. We see an official list, or a quasi-official list, at least in the official study guide. So the company's security policy handbook should include a section with guidance on phishing awareness. And this should also include guidance on reporting those suspicious messages. We should codify in our policy handbooks what we have trained users in our periodic security awareness training. Situational awareness. So train employees on the evolving threat landscape, emphasizing the increased risk of phishing attacks in a remote work environment, and teaching them to open emails from unknown senders with caution. We should educate employees about the dangers of insider threats, such as disgruntled coworkers who may attempt to steal data or interrupt business operations. This can help our employees to identify what may be potentially malicious requests from coworkers, but we also want to make sure that our entire IT and IT security staff are aware of the hallmarks, the common signs of insider threat. Mass download, mass upload, mass deletion. Doing a lot of work outside normal work hours. Continuing down the user guidance list, password management. We want to train employees on strong password creation and management practices and advise against password reuse across multiple sites and encourage the use of password managers. Removable media and cables. So reminding employees about the security risks associated with using removable media, USB drives, external hard drives, and public charging cables. Training should guide use of authorized devices and data encryption. Which means also from a security perspective, we should have controls in place that only allow the use of known, approved, removable media types, which you can typically control through policy-based administration using the ID of the various device types. Also on the list, social engineering, so educating employees on different social engineering techniques commonly used in phishing attacks. Training users on those 7 principles of social engineering. I have seen that play out in the real world, and it works. Over time and repetition, it creates a savvy user that can recognize social engineering attempts. Okay, this user guidance and training list is a long one, so to wrap it up, the last couple here. We have operational security, so training employees on operational security principles like being mindful of the information they share online or in public places, and risks of unsecured Wi-Fi networks or public computers. Hybrid and remote work are very common these days, so we need to develop specific security guidelines for remote work setups and include guidance on home Wi-Fi and work data on personal devices. So making sure our employees set up a secure home Wi-Fi network, and if we allow work data on personal devices, that we establish some guardrails and best practices. So let's talk development and execution. In developing our security awareness training, we want to develop training materials that are interesting, right? Engaging, informative, and tailored to the specific needs of the organization and its employees. We want to consider using also a variety of training methods. Everyone benefits from the employment of multiple training methods like online modules, interactive in-person workshops, video presentations, whether live or recorded. People have different preferences for learning, so we want to hit them all. Execution, so launching the security awareness training program across the organization, ensuring all employees participate regardless of location. Hybrid training sessions, on-site and remote, are very common, where some users are in a room with live instructors and others are on Zoom watching from home. And we need to promote the training program internally and encourage employees to actively participate and ask questions. Many organizations will establish learning goals and send out automated reminders to the users so they complete the training periodically by specific deadlines. And we need to regularly measure the effectiveness of the training program through assessments and reporting and make adjustments. So let's talk about assessment and reporting. So reporting and monitoring. So initially, we could conduct an assessment to gauge employees' current level of security awareness regarding phishing and related threats. Now, this could be achieved through surveys or knowledge-based tests, quizzes of a sort. And that can help us establish a baseline. And then we establish recurring training, scheduling regular security awareness training sessions to reinforce best practices and keep employees updated on the latest phishing tactics, the latest threats that they're going to face in their mailbox and out in the world. And we want to monitor reporting trends to identify areas where employees might need additional training or support. It is a fact that regular updates to training material are necessary to address evolving threats and employees' weak areas. So some companies will deliver training annually, others semi-annually. I'm a big fan of quarterly so we can keep employees apprised and gain that benefit of spaced repetition where we are having regular touch points with our employees to make them just a little bit better every time. Just as recurring contact with material, spaced repetition helps you with exam prep, it also helps your employees. Alrighty, my friends, that's a wrap on section 5.6 and indeed the end of domain 5 and a wrap on the Security Plus Exam Cram series. I will have a consolidated full course out in the next few days. As always, if you have questions, leave them in the comments. Drop me a line on LinkedIn. Always happy to help anywhere I can. I'll wish you the best of luck on your Security Plus exam. Be sure to come back and let me know your result. And I look forward to seeing you on a future exam prep series. And until next time, take care and stay safe.